Good. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Very well.
Can you?
Please, Manuela.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Besnik, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. Very happy to be here. And as Besnik said, I'm a project advisor for T-Factor for the European Commission. I work in EASME, which is the executive agency for small and medium enterprises of the European Commission, which is administering part of EU programs, including Horizon 2020. So I have the privilege to be the project advisor of T-Factor, which is a very promising project. So I'm very proud of it. And I really hope that it will really bring us new knowledge and new solutions for a crucial theme that is the one on meanwhile spaces and the time factor. I have to say it's crucial, and I remember when we had the kickoff meeting that it was discussing if it was a meanwhile or waiting time, and then decided more for the meanwhile. And I think it's right, because waiting time, it seems like that we are waiting for something to happen and we are still, but it's not like that, because in the waiting time, actually, it's in the meanwhile time, it's where probably the most interesting things are happening. In this sense, I remember, I mean, there is a quote that is quite social media one, but I think that is good for this meeting also. That is the one that life is what happens while you are busy doing other plans. So I'm wondering if it is the same for cities, what is really happening in cities today, while we are doing plan like we know everything about the future, but now in this uncertain time, as you mentioned in your title, we don't know exactly what is going to happen. We can make hypotheses and of course plan accordingly, sorry, but not to really to know what's really going on.
Emanuela, sorry, we cannot hear you anymore because we had to close the microphones. So you need to reactivate your microphone, please.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, very well.
Okay, good. So what I say, just that I'm very, I will leave the floor soon to my colleague Maciej Hoffman from the European Commission, DG Education and Culture, that will update, make some overview of what's going on EU policies based on culture, especially about cities and urban regeneration. Just to tell that, of course, the European Commission is supporting this kind of events, and there are a lot of new things happening because of this time and because of the COVID crisis. So, of course, the uncertainty is even stronger in this phase. And we know that we have to be adaptable, flexible, resilient, and whatever. We can discuss about it. So the agenda is very rich, and I will soon. So I think it's time to start. Just to reassure that we are really interested in what you're discussing and in the outcomes, because of course we need new knowledge and new solutions on this topic. So I really thank you for organizing this event. And now I'll leave the floor to my colleague Maciej. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuela. Please, Maciej, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, good morning. Can you all hear me well? I hope so.
Yeah, very well.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you, Emanuela, for this introduction as well. As Emanuela said, I would like to present to you a brief, let's say, overview in relation to European Union culture policy and where cities and the topic of urban regeneration comes in. It's going to be quite a concise presentation of roughly 10 minutes. So of course, I'm not going to discuss everything that is happening or will be happening in the coming months and years in the European Union, but I hope this might give you some kind of, let's say, hook or starting point. And then of course, just like Emanuela said, I'm also looking forward to hear more about your project, and I hope this is a start of a good, fruitful collaboration. And indeed, what's very important, I would say, is to link all these different projects and initiatives happening, so that we don't really work in the vacuum separately, but we find good ways to link different projects, and this is why I'm very happy to be on board. I've prepared some slides for you, so let's hope I can display them now.
You can, yeah, please.
Okay, I hope you can see it on your screens. So yeah, what I wanted to kind of present to you is, first of all, and more, I would say, of like political context and overview where European Union culture policy comes into play. Say very few words about programs, and give you 3 examples of specific projects linked to urban topics and culture. And then finish off with telling you a bit of about the current context, and of course the issue of COVID-19 that we are all dealing with in relation to the role of cultural sectors in the European Union, but also a bit of a glimpse into the future, and the future budgets and the future programs that are being currently negotiated for the future budget of the EU. So without further ado, first of all, the topic of where culture comes into play. So as probably most of you know, European Union's competence in relation to culture is strictly limited. It is actually said in Article 167 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union that the role of the EU is to help support member states and also find ways in which European Union can have this added value when it comes to European Union culture policy. So in this sense, the member states, cities and regions are, of course, very much independent in deciding on their culture policy. European Union is not interfering or imposing anything, but at the same time, what's important is that EU considers culture in this quite broad spectrum. So on the one hand, of course, looking at the intrinsic value of culture and culture initiatives, but also looking at ways in which culture can contribute to broader goals, such as, for instance, economic growth, social cohesion, social inclusion, well-being, topics such as gender equality, or also very much the issue of how culture heritage can help with resilience, sustainability, or innovation. And this also includes very much the urban aspect. And this is something you see when you look at this key European Union strategic documents on culture, such as New European Agenda for Culture from May 2018, the European Union Work Plan for Culture from 2019 to 2020, which is a document negotiated by European Union culture ministries every few years to decide on key topics on which European Union will work. And last but not least, also this important document, European Framework for Action on Cultural Heritage, which was proposed by the Commission at the end of 2018, as a bit of a legacy document, I would say, of a very successful European Year of Cultural Heritage 2018. And what's also quite important and crucial is that this European Year of Cultural Heritage 2018 was a good occasion for, I would say, for the whole of Europe, but also for many of us in the European Commission to join forces, to combine forces, and to look at how culture connects to these different bigger European topics. So, of course, again, it also includes the role of culture as such, but how culture links to local and regional development, how culture links to research and innovation, how culture links to the topics of SMEs and entrepreneurship. And I'm sure that Emanuela could testify to this, that it was also a very good year of collaboration within the European Commission. And Emanuela, as among some of the colleagues, was also very involved in this. So this is, I mean, to give you a bit of a context in which we operate. And of course, I very much encourage you to get familiar with some of these documents, because you can find quite a lot of interesting hooks and information about specific initiatives too that can be very much relevant for your project. So when it comes to the, let's say, European programs, European Union supports culture through a number of different funding mechanisms that exist. So Creative Europe is in fact the only program as such which was designed with having this in mind to support culture and creative sectors, culture heritage, but culture, or broadly understood culture and culture heritage projects, can also benefit from other programs. So of course, European Regional Development Fund, which I'm sure is also very much in your interest, the interest of your, let's say, specific project, to look at how structural funds and cohesion policy can support urban regeneration and culture. But then, of course, also Horizon 2020, from which your current project is financed. You can find examples of culture projects financed through Erasmus+, when it comes, for instance, to exchange and learning between cities. You can find examples in Interreg, transborder cooperation. And what's also important is this different European labels and prizes. So I'm sure you're very much familiar with European Capitals of Culture, which since 1985 was also allowing cities to think strategically about their cultural resources, think in which way, of course, on the one hand, celebrating culture and diversity, but on the other hand, how you can involve culture in your local development, your urban regeneration, and your forward planning. So these are also very important initiatives. I have these 3 specific examples I wanted to give to you of current and ongoing projects from Creative Europe that link to the topic of culture, cultural heritage, and urban topics. First of them, Cultural Heritage in Action, is a project we started this year. It's a bit of a peer learning scheme for local stakeholders and local authorities on how you can also include cultural heritage and think strategically from these 3 different, I would say, angles. So on the one hand, adaptive reuse of cultural heritage, the issue of quality principles of cultural heritage interventions, and last but not least, participatory governance of cultural heritage. So these are the 3 distinct topics within this peer learning scheme. The project is ongoing. If you go on the website, you will see that what happened recently is that the consortium running this project, the consortium is led by Eurocities, but it also regroups a number of other important European actors working on cultural heritage, architecture, and urban and regional topics. They have selected these 32 specific case studies from European cities and regions. And what's going to follow now is this peer learning exchanges that we will be organizing in coming months and early next year. We were planning to have specific physical study visits in place. Of course, because of COVID, we have to see how to best do it. Maybe it will have a bit of an online spin to it, but I very much encourage you to discover this topic and this project. Another example and another Creative Europe project is the Art and the Wellbeing project, which also started this year. It is a project also regrouping a number of European partners, and it looks at how culture and cultural heritage and culture and creative sectors can help with supporting health and well-being on the local level. So this is another project which is slightly more artistic in scope, I would say, but has this very much, of course, important urban dimension to it. So this is another example of a project that you can find supported by Creative Europe. And last but not least, what we also do very much in our work is political collaboration. So really looking at the policy level. And this is another initiative that started this year. Together with the OECD, we are looking at how culture can enhance local development strategies in cities and regions across Europe. But of course, since OECD works on the global level, we also want to confront and compare different examples from across the world. And we are going to actually officially start this project early December with an online webinar held by OECD. So I also very much encourage you to discover it. Later you will receive my presentation, so we will of course have all the links available there. So also please stay tuned, and I hope this is something that might be of interest and relevance to you. So of course these are just 3 different examples I gave here because of lack of time, but you can find much more of them. And again, looking at different European Union programs. So if you look at Horizon 2020, you find very interesting projects. Here on my slide, you see a few examples of such projects, such as Rock Project, this year coming to an end, Urban Maestro or Open Heritage, but also projects Finance and Click, project that looks at cultural heritage adaptive reuse. Again, you can find another examples in Creative Europe, such as Culture and Creative Spaces and Cities projects, which looks at this notion of cultural commons and also this different cultural spaces that exist in European cities and how they can interact with policymakers when designing good urban policies. This is probably also quite interesting for you. But again, there's plenty of examples you can find inspiration from. So I really hope that your project will also find these links with different initiatives that happened in the past or that are happening now. So now jumping into the current context, as I promised earlier, I wanted to tell you a bit about where we are now. And of course, when it comes to culture and creative sectors and cultural heritage in the European Commission, since March, we have been very busy with the topic of COVID-19 and very unfortunate, of course, and difficult situation now that culture is facing, and it's also facing this situation very much in cities across Europe. So what we're trying to do is, on the one hand, look at how the programs that we have at hand, such as Creative Europe, can be flexible with current and upcoming projects, in which ways we can also provide some additional support. We are also trying to encourage cities, regions, and member states to make use of these different horizontal European Union measures that were put in place to tackle the COVID-19 crisis, but also to, in a way, advocate that there are ways in which some of these horizontal sources can be used for supporting cultural sectors. What's, of course, very important too for us is to work very closely with member states, and this is kind of, let's say, policy collaboration that we are having in the framework of this Work Plan for Culture 2019-2022 that I mentioned earlier. And there's also a number of very important topics we're addressing with EU member states experts. These topics also relate to the questions such as quality of architecture and public spaces, the topic on how to address digital audiences, how cultural institutions can reach them, and of course all different kinds of exchanges of information. But I don't have time, of course, to go in detail here, but I'll be happy to be in touch with your project and also give you some further information if you're interested. What's of course very important at this very difficult moment is to exchange information about different local initiatives that are happening. And of course, cities are in a way in the forefront of addressing the COVID-19 crisis, also when it comes to cultural and creative sectors. So what we were doing and what we also did since May, we launched this Creatives Unite platform. And the idea here is to put in one place different initiatives that exist also on local, national, or European level in order to address this crisis. And I very much encourage you to go and discover this website, creativesunite.eu, because you can find very interesting examples on different initiatives put in place to again address the coronavirus crisis and the negative repercussions on cultural sectors. And you can find also very nice and inspiring examples coming from European cities. So this is also a bit of a context in which we work and what we try to do. So really to help with this exchange of information in these difficult times. And last but not least, the question of the future budget. So as probably also many of you know, we're in this very much turning point now with negotiations of the future European Union budget and the future programs and initiatives that will span from 2021, from next year, until 2027. So in a way, one of our, let's say, missions in the Commission as Directorate General for Education and Culture is to make sure that there are opportunities for culture in the future European program. So of course, again, Creative Europe, which is de facto only program designed for culture, but of course also other programs. And here, for instance, also Horizon Europe will be very important with this very specific cluster for culture and creative sectors, but also future cohesion policy, making sure that cities can invest structural funds in culture and creative sectors and cultural heritage, but also different other programs such as InvestEU, Digital Europe, ReactEU, which is also an initiative that will help cities and regions address the negative repercussions of COVID. So this is in a way our role to help and mainstream culture into these different programs, and again make sure that there are opportunities for culture in these future programs. So in a nutshell, that's it. I think it was quite a heavy presentation, but again, I hope that you're able to take something out of it. And what I would like to encourage you as a bit of a last message is to really stay in touch and stay up to date with what's happening when it comes to European Union culture policy. The easiest way, of course, of doing it is by following Creative Europe on the social media, on Facebook and on Twitter. And our colleagues in DG Ag also make sure to share information not only about Creative Europe initiatives, but also very different European Union initiatives and programs that are related to culture. So this is, of course, the best way to do it. And of course, I also very much encourage you to get in touch with me if you would like to follow on specific points that I raised. I will only be able to stay with you until 10 a.m. because then I have to leave for another meeting. But again, I was very happy to be able to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to also following your project and working together with you. So thank you very much.
So in the next 4 years, T-Factor is going to try to shine light into the meanwhile strategy of 8 advanced cases. We're going to try to learn from them, what worked, what didn't, and then we're going to try to put that knowledge into practice into 6 pilot cities. Well, today we have with us 3 magnificent examples of the front row experience, who will be talking about 3 specific areas included in our project. We will first hear from 2 advanced cases in London, in Dortmund, and then we're going to focus on one of the host areas in our local pilots in Amsterdam. So we're gonna start with London, a city where you could say a lot of the things that spread all over the world happened for the first time. And for that, we have the pleasure to have with us Mr. Peter Bishop, who is an urban planner and an urban designer and professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture. And before that, he worked at senior level in the London government for 25 years. He also has a wonderful book that probably a lot of you already read, The Temporary City, published in 2012. And he's a specialist on how cities evolve and how those forces that shape them outside the conscious, planified design process can become a key asset. So Peter Bishop, please, the screens are yours. Go ahead. Peter, are you there?
I'm there. I'm trying to find, I'm pressing share screen. I'm not finding my presentation. It should be here somewhere.
Perfect.
Is that coming up on screen share?
It's perfect. We're seeing already the...
Have you got that?
Yes.
First slide. Great. Okay, thank you. I've got about 10 minutes. This is a really quick whiz through a couple of case studies in London, which are slightly different, I think, different perspectives. Just to reflect, I wrote the book, The Temporary City. Gosh, it's written 8 or 9 years ago. I think at the time, it was almost one of the first books that had tried to find some kind of common elements between temporary interventions. I mean, it now seems an awful long time ago, and there's a huge amount of research that's happened since, and a huge amount of practice. So I'm going to talk about 2 case studies in London, but I'm going to start off by just talking about general terms about the nature of the city. And I think this is important because the key thing about our cities, which we know, is they're never complete and they're always adapting. And they're very, very organic. I mean, good cities, I mean, the kind of examples we've just seen are the ways in which you use the organic nature of spaces and people's interactions as one of the key elements in building strategies around temporary uses. And though this slide is absolutely obvious, it is extraordinary how few people in practice really think about their work as part of a continuum which started with context and ends with opening up opportunities for the future rather than closing them down. Design is 4-dimensional, and that's the big shift in thinking, I think, in the last 20 years, that this idea of the time element, which has been, and in many ways still is, neglected in practice. But 3 things. Good design builds out of context. Its spatial context, its social, its economic, and its cultural, and its political context. Good design enables what happens next. It's open-ended, and it recognizes it's part of a sequential set of interventions in the city. And good design also thinks about what happens in the interludes in between different parts of the evolution of the city. And the 2 examples I'm going to use are one in Dalston, which is a project we did at Design for London, and the other one on the King's Cross scheme, to try and demonstrate these 3 different layers. But first of all, your temporary activity, it's an intentional interim. Everything is temporary, but it is intentionally thought of and designed as an interim with a big question mark as to how long it lasts or what happens next. And it can be spontaneous. I mean, stuff happening in the city by the minute, people using spaces in different ways. It can be state planned. I mean, the city of Paris has done some quite interesting things around changing the nature of space seasonally, the Paris plage, for example, creating a beach along the Seine. It's been used as strategies. This is the temporary rebuilding of the city centre in Christchurch after the earthquake, where the real benefit actually was the re-establishment of civic life after an intense public trauma of an earthquake. It can be used as a case in London of 3 examples of the same site. It was a car park. It was used as a community lido, a community gardening centre, and as a community bar. It's now been developed. And this is sort of 3 different ways in which a site is used while we're waiting to see what's going to happen. And it can be kind of wonderfully spontaneous. This is the work of Rebar in San Francisco. Their hypothesis is that if you put enough money in the parking meter at the beginning of the day, you can park your car there, or you've basically rented a piece of city. And what I've always liked about temporary uses is it allows a challenge as to how we value space within our communities and within our cities. And what has emerged during my own period of practice, my own sort of professional life, has been a really interesting shift of design away from a single element where you're designing a spatial piece of the city, whether it be a building or a public space, and increasingly towards thinking about how you manage the city and how you curate and how you stimulate those spaces. This has actually become a far more interesting area to operate. It's made our lives a lot richer. We're now working with artists, theatre managers, events managers, installation people. And it's made our cities far more interesting in design elements. So purely thinking that your work as a designer finishes when you hand your plans over to the contractor. So 2 examples. First of all, in Dalston, we started with a design philosophy which embraced this idea of tactical or interim urbanism, and working deeply within the DNA of that community, poor community in just north of the centre of London. And we start off, I wanted to value what's there, nurture the possible, define what's missing. And this to me is a kind of good practical working methodology in terms of how you define temporary uses in an area of change. They fit extremely well into open collaborative working. All the work we did at Design for London was based on design charrettes. We'd rent a shop, we put our design teams down there, and we'd spend 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks down there, talking, arguing, drawing, drinking, partying, walking around the area, and building up a multi-layered idea as to how people saw their communities. And as Laura said, I mean, the great thing about temporary uses is it's relatively low risk. You can prototype, you can experiment. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, it doesn't really matter. You move on. But what it does achieve is a degree of community resilience and confidence and capacity building, which otherwise wouldn't be there. And I'll come on to that at the end. This is Dalston, area in transition, under development pressure in North London. We started off with our architectural teams and first of all mapping the area. Mapping and recording was an absolutely key element of all of our work, really understanding how the area worked and what we'd inherited. We were valuing what is there. We then looked at working within what's missing and working within the possible and coming up with really simple diagrams that we could talk to people about and involve them in decisions about their estates, and then turning that into a series of actions. So taking up this idea of the incremental, the tactical urbanism, putting the neon back on a cinema, putting in rather nice painted street names on buildings, but also discovering spaces which have been left over, owned by the public authorities but abandoned, opening them up, designing them with the community, building, in this case, a community garden, putting in events, working with events managers, the local theatre group to bring people in and get that ownership. Just around the corner, we developed a new square, but then brought in Andy Shepherd, the jazz saxophonist, with 200 other saxophonists. We had a party, we had an event, we scheduled events to highlight that this is a new space here to be used by the local community. And then on other days, we used soft play equipment to change the nature of the space. So this is choreography of spaces. These are a whole sequence of small temporary uses within the same piece of city, carefully managed, carefully curated, carefully designed to try and actually create a momentum and a sense of community ownership. And then finally, we looked at ways of recovering parts of the highway, annexing in terms of new planting, encouraging tables and chairs outside, trying to turn London into a cafe culture. And the key thing about this was, none of these interventions was particularly important as a single intervention, but collectively, it started to change the whole way in which people saw their community. And the final thing that happened in Dalston, long after as a design team we disbanded and we went away, there was a threat to that community garden. The local supermarket wanted to develop it as part of the entrance to their supermarket. The community came together, they fought it and they won. And that to me is probably the most important legacy of the temporary activities. We built political awareness, we built capacity, we built confidence, and we left behind a community that had a set of skills which allowed them to look after their own interests in the future, far more important than any of the design interventions we did. Another definition of temporary activity, a set of choreographed future phases. It can be the ways in which we're beginning to see architecture. And one of the really interesting developments in the design of a lot of commercial buildings now in London is, good architectural practices are thinking about a shell which might have 4 or 5 different uses over time. We begin to build in flexibility. We begin to realize that this is a lot more sustainable, and the carbon costs of a building that could be continually adapted and reused are considerably less than a big solid piece of architecture. Take that into the way in which you see the city. And I think the temporary activity works very well at the local level, where you start to dissect the city, you take it apart, you examine its particular elements, you work out what isn't working, and you put it back together with the local communities in a way that might be more effective. And with it comes this idea of alternative master plans, where you build up 60, 70, 80 small actions, can be sequenced in different, they can be implemented in different sequences, they can be built out over time, they can take different funding streams, they can be opportunistic, but slowly, they build new pieces of city in a way that in the present uncertainties, it's very, very difficult to come up with 5, 10-year programming strategies. We don't have the public funds, but the public funds are there if you can tap into them sequentially. And sort of similar example, I think, to Laura's diagram in many ways, but this idea that this came from the Temporary City book. This idea is not about doing something temporary until you can do something permanent. Actually, there's no difference. The bottom diagram, this idea of you start something, some things work, some things don't work, some things become actually rather permanent, other things become so successful they move. But the prototyping and the experimentation takes you off into different directions, and that is the interesting thing. You have a broad goal, but quite often you try something that makes you redefine what your end product might have been, and you try and incorporate it within it. And then the final quick example is the King's Cross development. Big commercial development right next to the University of the Arts in London. Roughly 27 hectares of land, which became available 20 years ago. And in thinking about how we tackled this regeneration opportunity, we came up with a set of key objectives. We started with a blank piece of paper with the developer, and we said, what is a good piece of city? We defined objectives, and we did a huge consultation exercise where we spoke to 30,000 people personally, to myself as the planning director and the developer, over the course of the negotiations. But the key thing was that we identified from this was this idea that King's Cross should be another piece of London. It wasn't going to be something like Marina Bay in Singapore. It wasn't going to be something like Midtown in Manhattan. It was going to be organic, like the first slide, organic and constantly able to adapt. It was going to be inclusive. We agree. One of our early slides, we agree with the community is, you know, we want a place where you're encouraged to do stuff. You're not told not to do stuff. And then we built up a basic master plan with, in consultation. We talked about key moves and understanding of how you start to construct the spatial master plan in a very public way, so people can understand and contribute to the reasoning behind it. And one of the key early moves was to recognize that this was not a blank canvas. And it comes back to an early slide. We had context. This area had been redeveloped constantly and adapted over 180 years before we became involved in it. And therefore, recognizing the context and realized that we had a really rich local heritage, which was valued, which contained memories, and incorporating it and embedding it in a development was key. And recognizing that if we kept the historic fabric, we could develop a piece of integrated city around it, where that historic fabric would have rationale and be embedded. And the reason for going over this, it goes back to this idea, this continuum, going back in the case of King's Cross to the 1820s, we were just stewards of this piece of city for a very, very small part of its history. We had a responsibility to build on what had been there and develop it further. And the key thing was to come up with a master plan that could be adapted by the next generation. And we adopted a simple idea of a number of development zones within which you could slot individual buildings. And in 20, 50, 100 years' time, you could take these buildings out and replace them without demolishing the entire site. So it was resilient. And we modeled the master plan up to 250 years in the future to look at ways in which the next generations could constantly adapt this piece of city and actually turn into something which was fit for purpose for their period, as opposed to something which we designed for the early years of the 21st century. The final master plan. And then within it, we thought about the interims. We thought about what do you do as development is taking place. The developer committed to producing a set of temporary installations. This was an old petrol station, turned into something called the filling station, which is a restaurant and cafe. It lasted 2 years and it's now been developed. It was part of the story. We had a skip garden where community farming can be, farmed in building skips and then moved around as development takes place. And that's still there on site. And in particular, the developer committed to choreographing events in the public space to generate footfall and generate excitement. So we're thinking on layers from one event lasting an afternoon through to a skip garden that could be moved over 20 years as development was phased, to thinking about how the development might be adapted in 50, 100, and 150 years' time. And a whole series of other temporary uses, which were temporary. The swimming pool, you could swim in King's Cross for 2 years, that's now gone, and that's fine. It was part of that story that was unfolding. And that's the final master plan for King's Cross. I think that's my last slide. So thank you. That's my last slide. Temporary city, infinite possibilities, is fluid. And actually, to pick up a sort of slight variation of what Laura said, it's about tolerance. It's about places where you allow stuff to happen that you hadn't thought of yourselves. That makes cities actually rather good places to live in. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. I can only imagine the pleasure it should be walk across London with you and all those behind the curtain stories that you have about how cities unfold and become what they actually are. Well, I guess it would be a good moment to hear if we have some questions from the audience for Peter Bishop. If you have some questions, please put them in the chat. I, of course, have many of them in case nobody is the first volunteer. But maybe in the meantime, we can start with one of those. What would you say your younger self 25 years ago about Meanwhile Spaces, now that you've gained all this experience? What do you wish you would have known 25 years ago?
I'd have probably said to myself 25 years ago, be more radical, use it more. And I think at the time, it emerged actually out of a design for London. We first became really aware of this in, I suppose, about 20 years ago. Because we're interested in this idea of this tactical urbanism, this idea of fluid master plans. Because in London, as a design team, we had no power and no money. And that's brilliant, because we also meant we had no responsibilities. And that's really good, working for city government without responsibility. But so no power, no money. And therefore we had to try and think of ways in which we could tap into other people's power and other people's money and get it focused within big ideas with simple ways to implement it. So that's how I became involved. And from that, you realize that actually you can do stuff. And actually it's called temporary urbanism. That is how I first really became aware of it. I think going back, I'd have done an awful lot more. And so final point to make is that, we did a huge program called 100 Public Spaces for London, which I'm all very proud of. It has achieved, maybe, we don't know, it might have achieved 100 public spaces. It's achieved an awful lot. But when we were wrestling, trying to build public space, which is difficult, you've got stakeholders, you've got utilities, you've got funding streams, you've got programming. Janet Sadiq Khan in New York closed Broadway overnight, painted blue paint on the surface, put tables and chairs and pot plants, and she produced a whole series of instant temporary public spaces. And we were so angry. We hadn't thought of that. We should have seen that one. So we'd have done a lot more stuff like that in London.
Well, we have a question from Laura. She's asking, how do we interpret permanence in these present times? Can we actually plan cities for permanence nowadays?
Oh, gosh. I'd say spatially, no. I think it depends how you see the role of planning and how you see permanence. Certainly resilience, building in very, very long-term resilience, I think is really important. And I've become very interested recently in this idea of relationship between the city and its natural hinterland, and the way in which the city and the countryside actually should come together in terms of ecology, water, resilience, flooding, etc. I think that's where we probably should be thinking long-term in kind of structural ways. Physically and spatially, I think my answer is no. And I think we should really challenge anything that looks too permanent. And one of the kind of deeply, deeply shocking things you see over a lot of the developing world is this idea of incredibly permanent stuff being put in, especially things like road networks, motorway networks, etc., and buildings sitting in space, which actually are going to have to be demolished in 25 years or 30 years' time, because they cannot be adapted. I think that's the real problem. So I think my answer is there is no permanent state. You should challenge everything about what it does now, what it'll do in the future, and what happens next. But the permanence of our thinking has to be around the long-term resilience of our cities and the life within them.
I think that's a fantastic closing remark. Well, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I think that we will review. I mean, I will re-study everything that you've said, because as I said at the beginning, London is the proof of concept, and somehow a lot of the things that happen there for the first time end up having in my city and all over the planet. So it's very interesting and insightful to hear the story of how do you plan hands-on with the maps. Thank you.
Yes, I'll just quickly interject. It's very nice of you to say that, but we were inspired by Berlin and Dutch planning theory. So people were there before us. So
that's fair also. But Amsterdam is also in our consortium, and we have a German brother of Berlin, the city of Dortmund, which actually I'm going to introduce right now, because the second example we're going to talk about right now is the case of the U Tower, or the Dortmunder U, a former brewery building that since 2010 has been transformed into a center for the arts and creativity, housing the Museum Oswald, the Hardware Mederkunstweren, excuse for my German, I still have to improve it, the City of Dortmund's Cultural Office, the Dortmund University, and many other diverse stakeholders that took over this building that was actually the first high-rise building in Dortmund, made in 1926. And we are going to hear this presentation with a very evocative title, Temporary versus Permanent, The Challenge of Expectations, by Arne Elias from the City of Dortmund Economic Development Agency. And both the City of Dortmund and the Dortmund University TU are partners in the T-Factor Consortium team. So Arne, please go ahead whenever you can.
Thank you, Karim. I'll try to share my screen. Hopefully the right one. No, it's the wrong one. One moment. I'll take this one. So hopefully you can see my title template, Dortmund Temporary versus Permanent.
Perfectly.
Perfectly. Okay, thank you. Yeah, temporary versus permanent, the challenge of expectations. One expectation I have to cancel in the beginning. I will not talk about the U Tower, but perhaps about some other things in Dortmund. So let me begin. Knowing my English is a little bit rusty, I made a few notes, and I hope you can all understand me, because my written English is at least a little better than my spoken. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to build up and activate my skills again over the next 4 years in this project. But today I'm trying with my notes. So in any case, we feel honored to be able to participate in T-Factor, even more naturally that we should be part of this consortium at an advanced case. Nevertheless, we are of course also learners and excited about the knowledge that T-Factor will provide us within the next few years. Especially myself, of course, because today I'm speaking for a subject area that only marginally affects my everyday work at Dortmund Economic Development Agency. Of course, in the last few days, I have consulted with some colleagues about what could be points that an international audience is particularly interested in with the view of the regeneration of historical urban areas and temporary use concepts. So I've been thinking a lot over the past few days. What is special about Dortmund and what makes us an advanced case? And what is the special thing I want to presenting today? So I could have talked about our business location, about Dortmund as a city of traditions, about coal, steel, and beer, about structural change and work, and today's economic millipede with a focus on logistics and digitalization, the basis for our crisis-proof economic policy. At the same time, I could have talked about the technology center and the technology park as an important point for an important innovative ecosystem in Dortmund. Of course, I also could have talked about our 10-year project Nordwärts, our innovative administration and participation processes, and the civil society, and if in doubt, the prizes we won for it. But the truth is, we are Dortmund, just a normal city in Northern Westphalia. We don't desperately desperately strive for the extraordinary, we are the normal ones, and a lot of what defines us you can also find elsewhere. So we still stick with Jürgen Klopp, and I think we are the normal ones. But maybe there's something special in that today. For us, it is normal that we build our ecosystem of administration, politics, civil society, science, and businesses decades ago. A system that may not be so normal for all cities. However, on this basis of low hierarchy networks, it enables us to push processes and projects and implement them successfully. For us, this leads to innovation and success in cooperation. Also because we want to activate the potential of the people and organizations in the city for our community challenges. Cooperation and collaboration at eye level. This is what we do. So today I could have talked about many projects, past, current, and future. Temporary use concepts played a role in many of them, and we are able to gain one or two experiences. These experiences are not always positive, but at the end, mostly. So I could have talked about the Dortmund U in example. I could have spoken, but there will be enough time to talk about the Dortmund U, I think, in the rest of our project. So especially with a view on meanwhile uses as part of larger revitalization projects of historic urban areas, I could have talked about our industrial area on Phoenix West, and perhaps about the Phoenix Lake, about the development of historic industrial areas into new places of work and living. At the same time, of course, I could have talked about the prizes the city of Dortmund has received for its urban development, but I also could have talked about the Smart Reno project. In the next few years, within the International Garden Exhibition 2027, the renaturation of the Emscher River and Dortmund's innovation space in a new decade project, a new district for work, living, and science is to be built on a former area of industrial wasteland. Today, however, I would like to focus on another but current example and focus on one problem. There's a high probability that successful temporary uses concepts tend to want to become permanent users. And I think within this risk, there lies a great opportunity to activate people and projects. So let's look at a specific example together. Since 2016, the Dortmund Economic Development Agency has been involved in the urban renewal process in Dortmund's northern part of the city and the development of the harbor and in particular of the Speicherstraße. Here, the old industrial areas should provide a new place for living and working on the water side. By implementing various industrial measures, this part of the northern part of the city is strengthened in a structure and upgraded in terms of urban development. At the same time, the improved access to the harbor basin creates an additional experience space that contributes to a stronger integration of the quarter into the district. A first step is to upgrade the area's infrastructure. The small-scale development of the harbor district takes place with the involvement of the private building owners. The existing buildings will either be renewed or replaced by new buildings. Until implementation, temporary meanwhile uses are a central component of the concept, also in order to integrate the local population in the process and an essential goal of opening up the quarter to residents of the northern part of the city from the start. This also applies in particular to the design of the squares and open spaces in the harbor district. As early as April 2016, a young Dortmund company approached the Economic Development Agency with the concept to implement a temporary gastronomic use here at this location. The Umschlagplatz may be translated as reloading point. The core of the concept was, we do not come to stay, but deliver a temporary concept with gastronomic business for the transition phase. In the period that followed, the Dortmund Economic Development Agency advised the company closely and supported it financially in implementing its concept. It was clear from the start that the conditions were not perfect due to the upcoming construction work. Nevertheless, the concept was a complete success, although the announced full opening times could not be realized. The Umschlagplatz has nevertheless established itself as a popular meeting point in the harbor and made the area attractive to new target groups. The main goal that the Economic Development Agency wanted to achieve with the temporary use concept were achieved. The location was clearly livened up, and this ensured a certain social control. New target groups, especially young creative people, were reached, and they could be emotionally bound to the location. The location was rediscovered by the intended target groups, and they made it to their place. These uses were initially limited to the end of 2018, but were extended twice until mid-2020 due to the slow progress in construction. Nevertheless, here too it turned out as predicted. Although the concept was intended as temporary use by mutual agreement and was actively offered by the company strives for permanent use at this site on its own terms and conditions. All offers from the city for a possible alternative location were rejected. In the public debate, the city was portrayed as a blocker, and among other things, the local elections were used to put the issue political on the agenda. In this way, the harbor became a symbol of a political debate between the civil society movement and urban district development. Here, the conflict between bottom-up urban design and top-down urban development was carried out openly. Nevertheless, and here I'm shortening the story, the main goals were achieved. And the open conflicts also led to an increased public participation of the development prospects in the quarter. In the meantime, a new location also has been found, only some 100 meters away from the original location, and these were some rejected ones. And the concept will be expanded further in the next few years, and additional players will join with new temporary uses in the gastronomic business. At this point, I would like to focus on 4 essential lessons learned and points to be considered and perhaps also to be discussed. First, trust, but do not rely on it. Working with temporary users in the development of projects required mutual trust. Trust has to be earned, and yet you cannot always rely on it. The uncertainties in this further development are an essential part of the project. Change perspectives need understanding. This can mature in a trusting environment. Second, environment and networks. Temporary meanwhile use concepts help to attract an attractive environment for the projects and create identification of new target groups with the projects. At the same time, they need the communal environment and networks in order not to develop a completely dynamic life of their own. You need to be close to the administration in order to develop the projects together. On the other hand, you need enough freedom to be able to develop. The actors need not to be killed by the near of the administration, their creativity. Third, structure and clear contracts. Accordingly, reliable conditions and a clear contractual regulation of possibilities and limits of development are required. This creates security and reliability. Fourth, competence and human resources. On the part of the municipality, competences and human resources are required to accompany the projects. Management and coordination resources are required on site to moderate various interests and conflicting goals. These resources are usually only available to a limited extent and are nevertheless an important success factor. Finally, temporary interim use concepts involve risks. However, these also offer significant opportunities for revitalization and making the projects more attractive. In order to take advantage of these opportunities, risk must be taken into account and, if possible, minimized through appropriate measures or at least made manageable. Although we often emphasized the risks in the last years, temporary uses and pop-up concepts are again becoming more important, especially in our strategies for dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So let me come to an end. What are a few risks in uncertain times if they come with opportunities? But maybe this is still a different topic, and I come to an end with this. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you for the honesty and the insights, Arne. It's a quite fascinating story, the one that you just told us, and I like to hear public officials about how conflict can also at some point become part of the motor, which is where the explosions happen for an increase in civic participation. And you can stop sharing your screen now. And
Okay.
in the meantime, I can ask the rest of the attendees whether they have any question for Arne. Well, we have one for both speakers that says that temporary use is shown here as an element mainly related to space design issues, but where are the functions somehow related to the social problem of the inhabitants of the area? And how could these temporary functions translate into solving key challenges in terms of employment, family violence, addiction, crime, etc., etc.? The question is open also to Peter, in case Peter's still there. I don't know if he had time to stay. I know he had to leave at some point, but if not, Arne, we can.
Perhaps a very short answer. I have not the chance to tell more about our northern part of the city because many of these points, because of employment, violence, addiction, crime, etc., are mainly focused in the northern part of Dortmund. So we have the Decade project Nordwärts, the northern works on these topics as a whole, and I had one sentence in my presentation about how our temporary users come to try to the social control topic. So I think the temporary users are here very important to activate the places and to activate the places, so there can be some social control for crime and addiction and maybe violence. But yeah, perhaps I'll leave it with this point.
Perhaps I could come in as well. If I understand the question, I think that if you design temporary uses or activities without a clear function or clear social function or clear function, then I think you're being really superficial and really shallow. I guess the kind of temporary use which really doesn't have a huge amount of purpose in the way in which we see cities. I think the brief for a temporary use strategy on a large scheme over time has to come out of dialogue with the people it affects, with the community. And therefore the kind of issues that have been mentioned by the question, if those are the issues, they should be embedded in the brief as to what those temporary activities are trying to do in terms of their function over the life of the project.
Well, thank you both for the answer. It came from Lodz Poland, who is actually also a member of the consortium, the EC1 project, rehabilitating an old factory over there will also be included in our advanced case studies. We have another question for Arne. Arne, from Andrea from the land team in Italy. What did not work in traditional regeneration projects such as Phoenix and Reno, which I guess are developments happening in Dortmund? And which are the challenges arising after the project completion? You have the questions on the chat in case you want to reread them. And then we have another one, but go ahead with this one.
Okay. Yes, I read it. Thank you. Reno is a project still to come, I think. We are in a very early stage with Smart Reno. So maybe there will something be that does not work. I expect that there will be conflicts between bottom up and top down as seen in the harbor, but that's speculations. In Phoenix, I cannot tell you so much about. We have colleagues who are even nearer in this topic. I have in the presentation the contact of Arne van der Brink in the publication he wrote in 2006 about the Phoenix West point. I think Phoenix West also is the industrial place not completed. With focus of Phoenixsee, yeah, well, I think it's a gentrification process which we haven't really in control in Phoenix Lake. So, but that might be the only point I can tell you today. But perhaps I can gather some information and provide them after.
Andrea is part of the T-Factor team, so I'm pretty sure you'll find a moment to talk about this and tell us about it, because it sounds fascinating. We have another last question of this session before we go to the Amsterdam speaker. This is for both Peter and Arne. Maybe Peter, you can start. What's the role of land property in allowing or fostering temporary uses? And was there discussions or experimentation on alternative ownership models in the cases presented?
Well, I think practice has shown that good property owners and good developers have been pretty instrumental in doing some very, very nice temporary use strategies. I mean, the reason why they do it is that it, in the case of King's Cross, it establishes the location and it establishes the place, and that has a commercial spin-off. I mean, that is just common sense to do that commercially because it's reflected in a more successful development at higher rents. It also builds bridges with the community you're going to live with as neighbours, and good developers recognise that, you know, getting on with your neighbours and tapping in to the resource of a neighbourhood or community is a huge particular benefit. So the second part of the question, that was the first part. What's the second part again?
Well, about alternative ownership models. Were there discussions on experimentation, on finding different ways to do it?
Yeah, in the case of Dalston, there were, and we set up a set of trusts because something which, again, we did learn very early on in Design for London is that as a designer, and I think it's on one of my slides, you have to work out the management regime after you finish designing on public space. If you don't, it'll just fail. And in some cases, you can find a good public authority, that's fine. But if you can't, in the case of Dalston, in some cases we couldn't, we set up things like community trusts and alternative models. And we persuaded the landowners, which were actually public authorities, to pass over control on leases for the duration of the project. So we did it there. King's Cross was different. King's Cross, the land was owned by a developer, and it was their land to do what they wished with, and there was never going to be a useful debate around alternative ownership models.
Mm-hmm. Well, Arne, do you have something to add, or shall we move on to Amsterdam?
I'm sorry, I think I don't have clear insight for this question, but perhaps at the moment, I think in Dortmund we are at a point where the landowners and property owners want to foster temporary uses as well and take them into their concepts of developing the areas. So, but no alternative ownership models as far as I get. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, all for your questions. And now let's move to our third speaker in this part of the session. We're going to talk now about Amsterdam. And as Peter mentioned before, Amsterdam is also one of these cities where things happen for the first time before spreading out globally. And they have this tradition of even taking and reclaiming land from the sea that is very, very Dutch. And precisely one of the examples that we're going to talk about right now is the Amsterdam Science Park, that will be one of the local pilots or early stage cases where we're going to try to put all the T-factor knowledge into practice. And the speaker today, Eric Bauer from Startup Village, University of Amsterdam, is going to talk about innovation hubs on university campus. And this Startup Village, University of Amsterdam, is actually located in the Amsterdam Science Park. That was before the Watersgraafmeer polder reclaimed from the sea in 629. And Amsterdam will be represented in the project by WAG. WAG is an entity that operates at the intersection of science, technology, and the arts. They are a proud member of the Fab Lab network that we also are a member too. If you know the famous Rembrandt painting where doctors are doing autopsies, that painting was actually painted in their headquarters in the building. That's another story. And WAG will be our link with the Amsterdam scene. And right now we're just gonna hear from the Amsterdam Science Park, where that actually is not exactly in these places of Amsterdam that we all know, but it's actually on the outskirts, in a place where you actually have to go. And in this place, the main development of the area was done by the University of Amsterdam, that has set up its own science campus, and the Dutch National Research Organization. And the municipality has provided permits to build temporary buildings as part of the area development that can potentially be transformed into permanent functions at some point. I'm very interested in the concept of Breedenplaats that the Amsterdam authorities use around the meanwhile uses. So I guess Eric is going to tell us a lot more about what's happening in the Amsterdam Science Park. So please, Eric, the screens are yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Well, good morning, everybody. And thank you also all the previous speakers. I see a lot of issues and themes and threads coming up in all the previous speakers that I recognize very much. So there must be something of a common ground in what we do somewhere. And I'm going to share my screen and let me know if that works.
Perfectly.
Yeah. Well, as we were already being nice to each other, London and Amsterdam and Germany, let me say that what we have done at the University Campus Science Park was actually inspired by a project in London, in Brixton, where a container village was built on a parking garage. So we inspire each other a lot, obviously, and also over the borders of countries. My perspective is a perspective from the university. I come from the business school, where I have been setting up and running the University Business Incubator. And this particular project that I'm going to talk about is the result of our quest, our search to have a location for the business incubator. At the moment, I transferred from this business incubator and the Startup Village location to another university in Amsterdam just a couple of months ago, at the second research university in the city, where they asked me to do a similar thing on their campus. So there is also a trend that we can spot there. I want to zoom in the case, of course, where I spend most of the time, but looking from a little bit higher perspective, zooming in from the changing role of universities to the city of Amsterdam, the Science Park, and finally to the case of the Startup Village, which I call a landmark for startups and innovation on the university campus. Going to the universities, universities are changing. It's about funding, It's about digital revolution. It's about internationalization. It's about different demands from society. It's about the pressure for impact. So there are a lot of factors, a lot of developments that pressure universities nowadays, and I think globally, but certainly in Europe, to rethink their societal value and their place in society. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing special about it. It happens to big organizations every couple of decades, and universities are in the middle, according to me, in this rethinking of their position in society. And one of the responses, an important response to these challenges, is to become more of an entrepreneurial university. Such an entrepreneurial university is a university that is more designed to give students and staff researchers opportunities to become entrepreneurial, to take risks, to be involved in innovation, and to get involved in public and private partnerships. It is also a university that is more dedicated than before in creating public value through a process of open engagement. There are some thinkers about the future of university that even go further and say that it's not only about entrepreneurial university, but even about entrepreneurial society, and that the universities in that society should not just promote more startups or technology transfer and knowledge transfer, but educate people that can thrive in that entrepreneurial society. And I think there is a link to temporary spaces, because, like a lot of other speakers said, we are living in a time of change, a time of changing cities, a time of changing societies, and the people living in that societies and the students we educate are important drivers now and in the future of that societal change. So let me now zoom into Amsterdam. Amsterdam became the European Capital of Innovation in 2016. It was a great event. It's a nice milestone, but behind that is a process of 10 to 15 years in which the city decided around 2007, 2008, based on an OECD review of the city, that it is very urgent for the city that universities, government, and business work together much more and are much more aligned to design a common strategic agenda for the city as they did before. They worked in silos. They were not or hardly in conversation with each other, each by themselves doing a great job, but not creating the value for the city that would be there if they worked together and in joining a common strategic agenda. And that development and that economic board, economic agency that came out of that review in 2007, 2008, in the end created in a innovative city that became capital of Europe, and also in a city that very rapidly grown in the global rankings of best ecosystems. This one is 2019. In 2020, it's even a few places higher. And Amsterdam today is, according at least to this ranking, one of the top innovative startup cities in Europe. And I think that's a great achievement, and it all goes back to this development that started some 15 years ago. So it's a more long-term process. One more slide about the city. We're going to zoom in later into the green star that you see on the right, but some of the other stars that I have here, they don't mean so much to you, but what they have in common, they're all places of innovation and startups. They are all located in buildings or places that belonged to, let me say, old industry. One is in an old bank building that is not used anymore after the financial crisis. Another one is in the Shell Tower, where Shell had its R&D facilities that they are not using anymore. A third one is in an old shipyard in the harbor. A fourth one is in an old diamond factory. etc., etc. So they all have in common that they are using spaces that belonged to what we call now old industry. And what they also have in common is that they are all, or at least almost all, initiated by entrepreneurs. So successful entrepreneurs, big entrepreneurs from the city, from the country, but mainly from the city, that took up the initiative and obviously saw a business opportunity in doing this, but also were willing to take up a public role in taking the risk of designing and putting their money in these kind of initiatives. So that's about the city. If we now move to the green star on the right, where is the Amsterdam Science Park located, which is the science campus of the University of Amsterdam, like it was said in the introduction. It's a piece of polder. It's a piece of polder on the east side of Amsterdam, and it's quite a big area, as you can see here. And there are research and teaching buildings on the campus. There's still a lot of space to develop there, which is very fortunate, especially nowadays in the city. It's the Amsterdam Science Park, and there all the science activities of the University of Amsterdam and some of the national institutes for research are concentrated. What you see in this graphic is that, and what makes the Science Park as a campus unique compared to other campuses in Amsterdam, is that it's not only about teaching and research, but it's also about entrepreneurship. So there are colleges, there are research institutes, but there's also a lot of space for companies to have their office there or execute their activities there. And as you can also see in the graphics, that between 2015 and 2020, all of them have grown, number of students, number of researchers and research institutes, and also a number of companies. And that's also thanks to the fact that there is space to build. There's going to be more permanent buildings still to be built in the years to come. But what we were lacking at the Amsterdam Science Park, actually in Amsterdam as a whole, was a place for innovation and startups on campus. We had our business incubator, but we did not have a location. We did not have a landmark for that. And that was the moment that we said, shouldn't we build something like this on the Science Park and experiment and see how it works, and what works and what will work and what will not work, and learn from it by building a temporary site. And it was actually built on wasteland. I told you the Science Park is a polder, and at the very, very east side of the polder, there was wasteland. There were no particular plans yet for the next 10 to 15 years to build something there. And that was not for nothing, because it was really on the side of the park where there was, and not in the heart of the park or the campus. So there were not many activities there, but it's ground owned by the university, and the university said to me, you can have that ground, you can use it to begin with for 5 years and build something of a temporary nature, so that we can experiment with the function and the role of startups and innovation on the campus. I was happy with that, but I was also not happy with that, because I was happy with the fact that we could do this and build it and design it. I was not happy with the fact that they located me somewhere on the very, very edge of the campus, because you want to be in the heart of the campus where the researchers, the students, and the entrepreneurs are. So we were in the beginning a little bit worried that it will work out, and how can we design it in such a way that people actually take the trouble of going to this location. That was 2016. And then, like I said in the beginning, inspired by the Brixton initiative in London, we decided to work with sea containers, secondhand and new. And we designed a place for startups and innovation, event space, a cafe, heart of the village, and also gave it, trying to give it, because of its size, a more village character. So accessible, easy for people to get to know each other, easy for people to sit together and have a cup of coffee, be it outside, be it inside, and also have a very, very different vibe than the rest of the campus. So that's when we started to build in 2016. While we were building, we were actually changing the design. I'll come back to that later when I go to lessons learned. Expanding it because it was actually a success in the beginning. What we planned was very, very quickly used and booked. So we expanded in 2 or 3 phases while we were building to make it bigger. And we opened it actually a year after we prepared the ground on this part of the campus to build a location. What we built is what you see here in the drawing. And this is very, very different from the architectural design that we did when we still had to build. So this is also a proof that when you do temporary spaces, you have also the opportunity to learn while you build and change the concept to a large degree, and not like a building that is designed, that is put away to an architect or a builder, and then it's very hard or difficult, or at least very expensive to change. And we could do that. We could experiment also while we were building. So we changed the cafe, we added the event space, and we added more space to the ground. And this is what it is today. A space for university startups, university companies, students, PhDs to have their first office on campus. A cafe where students can come and learn about innovation and entrepreneurship and follow workshops and training. An event space where we hold events together with corporates, the city, and all sorts of stakeholders in Amsterdam. What was needed for it is not so much. We needed a university ground. The university rented out to us. It's altogether 6,000 square meters. If I include also the first ground floor and first floor. We didn't need much. It's a lot of money, but also not that much. Not much more than a 2 million investment, which is a loan from the university. We had a 10-year business case, and we started a private company, a limited, a BV in Dutch, to actually exploit it also like a company ourselves. And the university borrowed money, and we're paying back the money in the years while we exploit. We used around 45 containers. We built a cafe and event space, and today we rent out and we support around 35 mainly software high-tech companies on the place. So this is what it is today. We call it Startup Village, a cool and dynamic hub for innovators, startups, students, academics, and business, and really trying to bring all these players together. That's also why we're so happy that the Waag is piloting on the Science Park and having their location with us. And what was very, very interesting, you can see it on this picture, is that not only on the way we developed the concept and things happened that we did not expect and we tried to anticipate, but around it, because it became very, very soon a success, mainly because of the students that liked it very much and came there in large numbers. The wasteland where we built was suddenly used for other functions as well. You see here in the picture on the left at the back of our startup village housing. It's housing for refugees. So there are about 150 students and 150 refugees living on the site. And what you can't see here is that the university also built a temporary site for its artificial intelligence institute. So in a few years' time, it became really a lively, very lively place to be proud of. It's an icon, so the fact that the place has this kind of look and feel, as you can see on the picture, it is also used, this is from one of the big Dutch newspapers, as an icon for Amsterdam, used for news or communication that is not particularly related to the startup village itself, but it became an architectural icon in itself, which was not planned at all. My lessons learned, last slide. If you want to work on innovation, entrepreneurship, startup on campus, and I imagine that it will count for any topic, a landmark is very, very important. It gave such an enormous incentive to the work we were doing already for many years. When we had our own location, you had visibility. It's different. People have opinions about it. People relate to it. So creating a landmark in this way is very, very important. The other lesson I learned here is that connectivity is very important. The Science Park is not new. It's there for 30 years already. The university moved there 10 years ago. So there was a lot of things going on at the Science Park already. And we had to connect to that. We did not, we should not have, we did not build something standalone. We tried to connect to what is there already, to involve students of placemaking, students of biology for greening the village. We involved different institutions of the Science Park. So we really tried to connect to what was there already. It was opportunity driven. There were a lot of opportunities on the way that we did not expect when we were planning this. And we really tried to accommodate these opportunities on the way. And that's also very much of an advantage of a temporary space. It's about people and not buildings. You can build, of course, the greatest things also on a temporary site, but it's people that have to use it, and it's people that have to come there, and it's people that give it shape and make it to what it will be today. And there's ownership. Of course, we had our own company, we built it on our own, but it's very, very important that the other players, the other stakeholders in the city, and at the Science Park in particular, saw it as something from themselves, that they felt ownership, that they were proud of this location, and that although they were not the owner, they still, the formal owner, they still feel that they own it. And like I said already, iterate, design while you build. These are my lessons learned from this project. I added COVID-19. No idea what the effect will be, but it will definitely have an effect. It's also an opportunity to kind of start again with this concept as soon as we are getting out of this crisis. I have a lot of thoughts about what the effect will be, but to be honest, at this point in time, I don't know. So this is my story about the Amsterdam Science Park in the Startup Village. Thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, we're of course happy if you want to be in contact with us in the future, and don't hesitate to do so.
Well,
so this is my story. I hope it's useful, and I hope that you recognize a lot of things that probably are in your context as well. And thank you very much once again for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. It's definitely interesting, and I really like the diversity of perspectives that we're getting in this panel, because as we say, we have in T-Factor, we have a lot of different perspectives, and that's probably one of the core assets of the project, that we're trying to put grassroots projects, city council officials, businesses, and universities to talk on the same conversations about where our cities are heading. Well, we're a little bit late, and I guess everybody needs a small coffee break, but first we are going to take just one or two questions. I do have one for you, Eric, and for the rest of the panelists, if they're still there, which is related with the role of culture and how these spaces, these meanwhile spaces, and the alternative reconfiguration, do-it-yourself style that has like the Startup Village campus made with containers instead of a standard building. Why is it so attractive for the dreamers, for the people who can at some point become the city makers? And what role do you think culture has to make Amsterdam attractive to these profiles that you want, entrepreneurs?
Well, if I speak for Amsterdam and for myself, what makes the place attractive for young people, and in the slipstream of them also for let's say their teachers and older people, but it started with the students, is that it's different. The buildings on the science park are very classical buildings, so not outward looking but inward looking. If you're in the building, you disappear, and then you are in your office or in the building or in the classroom, and this is an open space. You can just walk there, you can have a coffee, there's no obligation. You don't have to be an entrepreneur to be there. You can have a meeting. It's open. You can be outside if the weather is good. So I think the openness and the difference from the traditional buildings is something that that attracts people to come there. The second part of your question, Amsterdam, as an innovation entrepreneurship city, Amsterdam is very international. So it's very diverse. It has a very young population. It's not a very big city. It's around a little bit more than 1 million inhabitants, and 10% of them is students. So it's international. It has this kind of appeal and branding from history of tolerance. I'm not sure if it's still today so much as it used to be, but still it has this image. So I think that together makes it an interesting hub for young people with a desire to be innovative, entrepreneurial, to be there. So
I'm being asked in the chat whether it was the space was open to all local population or it was exclusively for university students. And
no, it's open to everybody. It's open to everybody. It's just open. There's no gate. There's no login. Everybody can walk in there or have a coffee or sit or meet. Also people from the neighborhood. Let's say non-campus residents. It's open to anyone. I think that's one of the very important aspects of it.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question from our team member Dario that is asking, how did meanwhile users actually influence the master plan? And were there stakeholders that were giving specific inputs on the changes to do so? You got a seat at the table on the master plan planification?
Well, the interesting thing, at least for my project, I can't speak for the other speakers in the panel, but was that the university said build something, and we rent the ground for you. This is what we have available, and the city said we'll give you a permit. And of course, the architect, and when you start building, it has to fit to all the liability criteria. So you have to have a permission to build what you want to build. But both university and city were very flexible. Also because it was meanwhile, so there are different rules engaged. So there was a lot of flexibility on both their sides. So they were really both eager to experiment something. And I think that was very important because that helped to overcome, let's say, university resistance. The university is often focused on control and not on risk. The city, that is very much focused on bureaucracy and not so much on make a mess of the city. So this openness of both stakeholders was very important for us.
Okay, and the process, this right now, the startup village is let's say meanwhile, but it could become permanent as the process evolves and it gets evaluated.
Yeah, that's it. We're in the middle of that.
Break because we're a little bit late.
Okay, sorry.
No, go ahead. That's my responsibility.
Well, I'll make it short. It was planned for 5 years. I got the permission for 5 years. Which is much too short to have a business case on it, but still we started. And then after 2 years, they said it's a great success. You get 5 more years. So I have 10 years now. And we're now in the process of making it 15 years. And also thinking about a more permanent facility.
Mm-hmm.
But we're in the middle of it.
We have another super interesting question about including the refugees housing in the project. Maybe you can just quickly mention it, how it happened, and then we go to the coffee break. Yeah,
I tried to be short, but it's an interesting story indeed. We have the refugee problem in Europe, as everybody knows, and the city of Amsterdam was forced by the government to take in a number of refugees, and the city of Amsterdam decided to not build one space, but 5 to 10 spaces in Amsterdam to accommodate housing for the refugees. And one of the locations that was pinpointed by the city was the Amsterdam Science Park. And to be honest, nobody at the Science Park was happy with it. We had fierce discussions about, do we want refugees on campus? And then they came to us because there was wasteland. And actually, I immediately said, I can see the risk, but it's also a great opportunity because as we are such an open space, and at the side of the campus, we also have security risks because in the weekends and the night, everybody can come there and steal. So if there are 250 people living next to us and having their houses there, it might very much help us to de-risk the security problem because there are people living there and you don't go there to steal anymore or break in. So we build it. We didn't build it, but the city built it. Yeah, it goes actually very well. It goes very well. We don't have any problems. So that's very nice.
Fascinating story. Well, thank you, Eric, for the time, the presentation, and the insights. Thank you, Arne. Thank you, Peter. And I am going to leave the floor to another colleague from the T-Factor team, Marco Tognetti. Marco is the CEO of Lama, which is an innovation agency based in Firenze, Florencia, that is at the core center of the coordination of the project. So Marco, please go ahead.
Thanks, Karim, and thanks everybody. Sorry for the little delay in the timing, but I'm sure now we will enjoy this session. I'm very proud to moderate this session today, and I'm really happy to see how many people are connected. Maybe this is the good face of the moon in these coronavirus times. So whilst we can meet in person, we can easily gather online. So thanks again for being here. I'll jump immediately into the topic. The title of this session is meanwhile participatory meanwhile uses, if there are costs or an opportunity in urban regeneration. And I think we all agree that meanwhile uses are important, and at least on 3 levels. We know that they can impact on the marketing activities of an area. We know also that they can contribute to manage the conflict and to build consensus with the citizens, and we also know that they can also build the pilot of final uses. So they are the spark of the uses of the regeneration intervention. But this implies that that we have to invest in meanwhile uses, and we can invest on different degrees according to the type of meanwhile user we want to realize. Phrasing in other terms the title of our session, the great question is that is if meanwhile uses are like the cherry on top of the cake. So if there is, yeah, great, we're happy. But if not, you at least have the cake, so there's no problem. Or if meanwhile uses are a fundamental ingredient of our cake. So if we don't have, it really changed the taste of the final product, so the cake. For trying to answer to this question, I'll be helped by Filippo Adari, who is CEO of Plus Value, and Plus Value is also a key partner in T-Factor. Filippo will spark the conversation with our distinguished panelists that I will introduce now, helping with some provocations to stimulate their reactions and listen to their suggestions and ideas about the topic. Our speakers are Giovanni Manfredi. Then we have Jonas Bistrom, he's a lead engineer at the European Investment Bank, and Laura Pellegrinelli, she's placemaking development manager at Lendlease. So I think we can leave the floor to Filippo with his provocations and trying to have this conversation. The format is the 3 speakers will have 10 minutes to react, and then I'll leave to some Q&A time with all the participants in this meeting. So thanks, Filippo. I'll leave the floor to you, and we'll hear with pleasure your provocations.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. I've been tasked to provoke our speakers, and so I prepared my script. But after listening to all these morning interventions, clearly I realized that my provocation is definitely necessary. Very interesting ideas and examples, but I believe my job is to play the devil advocate. I mean, we have been working with Plus Value, with investors and urban regeneration, big players for the last 5 years. I describe my job as swimming with the sharks, learning how their feeding habits not to be turned into their next meal. What does it mean? It means that when we work with very serious, big regeneration projects, we work with hungry, driven players, animals. And watch out. I mean, there is no difference between the public and the private, by the way. They just have different feeding habits. The ones of the private, it's more on the profit. The one of the public is on the political consensus. But this is a reality check that we need to have in mind, and we are not going to change their acquisitive instincts. Moreover, we have two more problems. On one side, we have COVID, which is taking a massive hit, as it was mentioned by previous speakers, on the value generation and sustainability of those projects. I mean, construction sites are stuck. There is an increase of costs, plus people cannot use them. So that is a massive problem, I believe, for meanwhile processes. But also there was one point raised by several speakers, the value of meanwhile projects to build trust, ownership, let's say also to manage the risk of having the community to backfire. Now, how do we match this with the rise of populism and constant and systematic distrust by the public towards big projects led by the public or the private investors? This is serious stuff. Now, in our experience, we learned over these years that there isn't a magic formula, there is no model, there is no map to follow, but a very simple principle has to be, is a guiding star for our work, that you need to align public and private interests. Investors understand and have interest, and they are very happy to generate public value when this is aligned with their own plans and interest. And this is possible, as for instance, the good example of the one in the Amsterdam showed, and there are many others. Now, to do this, we need to understand the value of these meanwhile projects in a very realistic and concrete way. So for a moment, idealists, shut down and let's have an hard conversation. So my questions for our speakers, who actually represent a wide array of public and private investors, is about the value of meanwhile interests. How do you value how do you define value those meanwhile projects, and how do you measure it? And measuring means not writing a nice glossy report for the public. It's also about reporting to your shareholders who want to understand why you are spending time and resources on those projects. Moreover, when we talk about value, it seems that those meanwhile projects, except for some visionary, enlightened or crazy investors, they tend to fall on the shoulders of, or it would be more correct to say in the budget of the public authorities, especially local authorities, or in the budget of philanthropic institutions. And if you're lucky, on the CSR program of corporation. Is this realistic and sustainable? Especially when we talk about long-term large projects. I think this is probably enough. If you will be able also to make references to the two issues. One is COVID, but the other one, and we must recognize it's transformative within the European context, is the European Green Deal. And so the green agenda, or the transition towards the green agenda, which is going to influence, although it's in infancy, and might play a very important role in giving value to those meanwhile projects. I stop here, and although I keep the role to, prop you if you don't answer as you should. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Filippo. Thank you very much. So, Giovanni, the floor is yours. 10 minutes to react.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm the shark. So when I like Filippo's introduction because it's refreshing and it goes straight to the point, which is something that I deal with every day in my role. I follow a large development in Florence that Marco is familiar with, and I think what Filippo mentioned goes right to the heart of some issues that I face, because we're investing a lot of money in meanwhile uses, and I have to justify that to a number of people, right? Mostly to my investors. Why do I need to spend those millions of euros? Because that's the order of magnitude. It's not 100,000 euros, it's millions. And on the other hand, to the neighborhood, the stakeholders, right? So very, very refreshing. I will try and go, straight to the point. How do you measure the value of meanwhile uses? I think meanwhile uses have three different kinds of values that must be measured differently. The first one is a financial value. What my investors, pension funds, are chiefly concerned with. They invest their money here because they need to pay their pensions. So financial is the one that I feel I should speak more about because it may be what I'm able to offer the more detailed perspective. The second type of value is, once you accept that we have to generate a profit in order to do our urban regeneration project, you can argue, however, about the quality of that project, that profit. That profit may be more sustainable or less sustainable. And I think if we as investors, we are able to accept a lower profit if it is a better quality profit. So that's the second value, I think. The second type of value is a sustainability value. The third value that I see is a social value. What Filippo mentioned in his intervention. So what we do on temporary activities may create or destroy a lot of value for other people, for society as a whole. Externalities, right? So these are the three types of values that I see. And like Filippo, I think there's a bigger discussion here, about how capitalism prices externalities, right? That we don't want to go into right now. I don't think it's the purpose of this discussion, because we could go on for hours about, how things are priced in a capitalistic society, and is it the correct way to organize a society? That is a discussion we're not going to go into. So we take for granted that society is capitalist, that I need to take my profit. That profit should be as sustainable as I can make it. But at the moment, I don't benefit from positive externalities in the same way as I'm not penalized by negative externalities, other than from an ethical point of view, right? And hopefully what I'm saying makes sense. It's a bit theoretical. I want to go in the financial value. So the first one of my three, and explain how I see, the financial value of meanwhile uses. I think, and many of you will have heard this before, but I'm a real estate investor. We invest in real estate. The old saying goes, real estate has three value drivers: location, location, and location, right? They say that is all. Everything else you can change, your location you cannot. Well, to me, that is really where meanwhile uses have a value. They are one of the few levers that we have as real estate investors to change location. I think the other two are infrastructure and anchors, right? I think with meanwhile uses, if they're done well in the way in which Marco has described, so they communicate, but they engage, and they are a prototype. They can really change where we are, right? Where we invest. That is how you measure the value of meanwhile uses purely in a financial point of view. So if you take the sharks, even the most terrible sharks will invest in meanwhile uses, if that means that your location becomes more rich, more vibrant, more diverse, more interesting, right? So I think one of the questions that Filippo posed was, who pays for it, right? If you are an ugly, evil shark, the answer to that question must be your customers, right? You run a business, forgetting about everything else. You need your customers to pay for that extra cost that you are doing. So that's the kind of the ugly truth, I think, as Filippo described it. So we need to sell for a slightly higher margin in order to justify it purely from a private capitalistic point of view. The good news is that investors are changing their perspective. So luckily, many of our investors, they're no longer the ugly, rationalistic, pure profit sharks. They do value the quality of the profit that they will generate, or the return that they will generate. Therefore, luckily, they're happy to pay some of their value because they see that they're happy to accept a lower financial return because we're doing something good. No, that is the third. That is the second, and it's also a big financing source because if you can finance yourself at a cheaper rate, then you can invest money. Social is difficult. Is the real bit that is difficult to finance for a private investor like us. But this is where there could be a positive collaboration, as Filippo says, with the public, as long as the interests are aligned. So that's a little bit how how I'd like to answer. I want to say one more thing, maybe two actually. One is that Filippo mentioned the distrust of the public versus a large project, and I can see that. I have it myself when I look at large projects that I'm not involved in. I think in Florence, and maybe here Marco as a Florentine can comment, Manifattura Tabacchi is quite well received. We have, surprisingly, a very good relationship with most stakeholders, the administration, the neighbors, etc. I think one of the reasons is that we have done the reasoning that Filippo has said very early on. So I think we're clear between us as to what our roles are. What is the role of the administration? What is the role of the private investor? And what is the role of the neighbors? And we have a dialogue without hypocrisy. No, I mean, if you pretend that you do an intervention, if you're a private person, a private organization, and you pretend that you do an intervention purely for social purposes, you're lying. And I think people feel that. So I think having an open conversation about the topics that Filippo has mentioned has really at the basis of this thing in project, but there's a private component. So I think people know that we have to do a project. They accept it as a profit. They accept it as a constraint, and that is the basis on which we can try to do as good quality a profit as we can, but also we can engage to try and generate the maximum amount of positive externalities that we can, as opposed to negative externalities. So yeah, I think this is quite hard as an answer, I think, Filippo, but I hope you were looking for that and not me shying away from my responsibility. I have a heart as well as a person, so I could tell, much more interesting stuff. I had prepared actually a much softer, richer speech, but I think it's more interesting if I do the hard part and give you the ability to retort. Hopefully, I haven't exceeded my 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. I'm really happy to know that even sharks have a heart. No, yeah, we know that. And no, but really the good news that sustainable profit and good profit is something that can be considered as an ethical improvement about how the investors look at investments. This is really an interesting thing on the side of intangible suggestions, while I think the other side, the leverage that meanwhile users can play in terms of going beyond the starting features of allocation. So allowing investors to measure the value they can create. This is also very definitely a very important point that can also help matching the intangible part with a very concrete part that Filippo was provoking and asking to react. As we are talking about investments, I think the opinion, the perspective of Jonas Bistrom from the European Investment Bank maybe now be really interesting to hear. So I'll leave the floor to Jonas. Please, if you are here, I'll leave to you 10 minutes to react to Filippo's presentation.
Hello, first of all, a check, can you hear me?
Yeah, definitely.
For some reason, the video does not really seem to be mobile. I don't know if that is a problem on my side. Can you see a moving, an active video?
I can't see your video, but I can hear you very well.
Turn it off and turn it on. I have it activated, but it seemed to not be working. So you will, now.
There you are, yeah.
Here I am, but not really very mobile. I don't know why it's freezing. Anyway, I will do what I can without the video, and you will do with what I say rather than with how I gesticulate. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to take part in this interesting session and to have an insight into this very interesting project, the T4 project, and also having got a good reason to dive in a bit further than I've done before into the topic of mean value uses. I think that since the EIB is a bit different kind of financial institution than what Giovanni presented before, a bit less shark-like, we can put it, it may be a good idea for me to just introduce the EIB, the European Investment Bank. I'm connecting from the headquarters in Luxembourg, and we are one of the EU institutions, the EU bank, the EU's long-term lending arm. And we are also a bank that focuses quite a lot on climate, on environmental sustainability. We're committed to dedicate 50% of our financing to these two objectives by 2025, and we are aiming to be fully Paris aligned by the end of this year. So climate, environmental sustainability is very high on our agenda. And as the EU bank, we are a policy-driven bank. So we are aligning what we do to policy made in Brussels, and we have 4 public policy goals that direct and indicate what we should finance, and that is environmental protection, it's infrastructure, it's innovation, and it's SMEs. So these are public policy goals that are in a way quite relevant to urban development, urban regeneration, and to some extent also to mean values, even though we have less direct experience of that, if any direct, and I come to that a bit later. In 2019, we provided 64 billion of financing to 854 projects, where 90% was in the EU, the rest outside the EU, and around a third of that was in urban areas. So we are doing a lot in supporting EU cities and also a few cities outside the EU. And while I am not able to point at direct investments in mean values, I will relate a bit to what we do and why it is relevant and interesting to us nevertheless. But I mean, as a person, I've seen the need and the rationale. The city in Sweden, Eskilstuna, where I come from, every time I go back, I see more and more high street center retail spaces being empty, not really being used for what they should, and there is a need to think mean values in that city. And in Luxembourg City, one of the richest, I think, cities in the EU, Luxembourg has the highest GDP per capita, there are also non-used retail space, and here the city has invested in a scheme to transform some of these into pop-up shops. So they enable startups, new entrepreneurs to rent very well located shops for a 6-month period to ensure that there is a bit more liveliness in the city and also more diversity shop-wise. But as a large institution, mainly working with large investments and where we have kind of procedures set up for those kind of investments, we are not really able to support the really small scale investments, and mean values may also in some cases, as we've heard and as we see, not necessarily involve really large capital expenditures. It could be renovating, refurnishing, and letting space for intermediate mean values. So from that reason, it's not so that we have a long list, or I can point at very concrete examples of how we have supported this. But nevertheless, I mean, in this urban sector, we support projects that make life in urban areas more sustainable. And often it is integrated urban development, urban regeneration, and renewal of different kinds. And in that context, there are also often mixed use schemes that may involve property developers, public sector developers, investors, and foster the kind of partnerships that the mean values is building on and that enable exploring this. And from that point of view, it is relevant for us to consider and to look into this. And we do it for a number of reasons, which I think I will try to summarize. First of all, the mean values can have an important urban development and regeneration impact. And as a public bank, we are not just interested in getting our money back with some interest, but also to have an impact, an additionality, to have value added, maybe beyond what a commercial bank can and should do, because we are, as I said, the public bank. We are working in the interest of the public good, and we try to promote the EU policies. And like we heard from the previous speaker, location is, of course, an important aspect in urban development regeneration. And then, redeveloping, enabling, and meanwhile use could be ways of promoting the densifying mixed-use development that is adding sustainability, adding ambience, and long-term livability in cities. And from that point of view, it is relevant and it is important. It also, like we've heard, and I think seen in many of the examples and previous presentations, have important economic development impact in the ability to enable, to facilitate, allow testing of new types of products, activities, maybe new business models, maybe new approaches to many of the things that we are doing and maybe are not doing in a very sustainable manner. So there are approaches, opportunities to really use these meanwhile use and the opportunities presented by really boost the economic opportunities, mobilizing maybe parts of the society that are not really businessmen and women, are not really used to taking the first steps into entrepreneurship. But like have been in the case in Luxembourg here with the pop-up shops, they have really enabled young, bright ideas to be tried out on a smaller scale. And as such, these meanwhile uses also have a social development impact, which is also relevant for a public bank like the EIB, not least by, as I referred to before, mobilizing a larger share of the population to engage in economic activities, in social activities, maybe with some economic aspects, and thereby also to widen the economic base of the city, to create new jobs, and to build local social resilience to whatever future may bring. COVID-19 is one example of very unforeseen events that have had a very, very large impact on society. And COVID-19 and meanwhile use, like someone said, it is reducing the use of whatever the meanwhile use entrepreneurs, renters are offering. But on the other hand, it's also creating new opportunities for meanwhile use. We see in many cities that the impact on the small scale companies and retailers is quite impactful, and there is more and more opportunities and more need to think meanwhile use in the further development and in the recovery after an epidemic or pandemic like the COVID-19. And finally, there are also, I think, in these various aspects of economic social development, also the opportunity for municipalities, for cities, for entrepreneurs, and for others to really promote sustainable and green developments. There are really good examples of how cities have invested in renovating old cultural heritage, for example. They have turned it into innovation labs, like we heard in some examples. They have turned it into circular testing labs and into other testing environments, or into office hotels or entrepreneurs hotels that, with the right kind of approach and support from those who operate them, could really entice and promote the impact of the selection of and the approach towards the more sustainable green approaches to use these meanwhile spaces. So from circular point of view, sharing, leasing, repair shops, second-hand sale are, I think, very interesting opportunities to consider and maybe to prioritize when approaching the opportunities to take such spaces into
constructive and also beneficial use for the city and for the urban environment. Also, if like examples have been made, thinking a bit long term, it's also then necessary to think of the opportunity to design new buildings, new developments, to allow and enable modular and flexible use, to ensure that buildings are having this modularity and the flexibility in the design briefs, so that whatever happens in the future, whatever changes there are in economic fabric, social fabrics, there are opportunities to remodulate, to realign to the need to maybe interim flexible uses, and then also to design not for demolition, but disassembly in the end. Measurement-wise, a bank like EIB, of course, with public money, has a lot of scrutiny on what we do. And we measure, like mentioned before, also the returns on the projects, financial returns, economic returns, looking a bit beyond just the financials. But being a climate, environmental, sustainability-driven bank, we also have very clear focus on what in the projects and the components we do in projects are really contributing to these two targets. We also try to measure jobs created. We are looking at other impact, etc. So we try really to measure not just profit returns, but also other more social, more environmental, more climate and impacts, where we can really see that we are adding value beyond maybe what a commercial bank can do. There was also a question and reference to who will and who should pay for this. And I am not sure I can give a clear and concrete answer to that, other than saying that maybe a good base to build a conclusion on that question is to look at who is actually benefiting from this meanwhile use. And in some cases, like we've heard, the developers could have a good benefit by marketing the future use of a development, by enabling testing of new approaches to using maybe mixed use developments, etc., etc. But there are also these more public, social, economic, environmental benefits of using meanwhile use spaces that may build the case for that municipalities could have a good reason and maybe a good interest to subsidize and to ensure that whatever is not possible for the developers to shoulder in the form of costs of renovating or setting in order could be covered through municipal subsidies, etc. I think time-wise, I probably passed my 10 minutes, and I'm happy to try to complement later on. But I think I rest the case for now anyway, to leave the floor for the next speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I underline just 3 things. First, it's really interesting, the mixed use scheme you were talking about. So the idea that an institution like the EIB might see with favor to support PPPs, so partnerships between public and private entities, as this leads to the second point that you evaluate with favor the additionalities that meanwhile uses can create. So all these elements, additional elements like the impact on social, environment and employability, etc. So it would be interesting to widen this conversation also with other investors like you are and with other banks, to understand if these additionalities can be seen as constraints to loans or as addition things to decide if to loan money to who entail these additionalities in its investment, or even if this might be seen as a reduction of risk. So the interest rate might be lower exactly because there are these additionalities. So this is very, very interesting. Maybe we will discuss it later on more in detail. And the last thing is you described meanwhile uses as a learning opportunity. So you mentioned the modularity and the business models that can be hosted into and during the time of these meanwhile uses, that they can represent a way to reshape not only the temporary uses, but also reshape how SMEs can regenerate their model to be more flexible and to accept this modularity that's especially in COVID time is so important. So thank you very much for your reflections and ideas. And now I'll leave the floor to Laura. So we go back to a developer from Lend-Lease, and happy to hear your point of view.
Thank you, Marco and Filippo, for inviting me here. I think this is a very interesting question. So I could say that from a developer perspective, there is more than one value on bringing meanwhile use on site. One is the social inclusion. This means that the meanwhile use installation is an opportunity to connect and to include the local community. It helps from a developer perspective to scale up the project, giving also the opportunity to know each other, then for the developer to better understand the potential of that area, knowing associations and people to be involved, and for the community to get close to the project and to start feeling and growing the sense of belonging, which is a very interesting trait of our regeneration projects. Another value is, let's say, to start bringing people, to increase the footfall, in a way to anticipate to the public an area which will be their area. And it means for a developer to start building the place experience of the entire project and to build what we call a destination. And this point, I think it's very linked to what Giovanni said before, to the quality of the place. So if you increase the quality of the place, then you have other tenants, other people who wants to live, to work there. So meanwhile, really helps to build that destination. And another value is also to support the local business, giving them these temporary and open spaces. Often these spaces are in a small format, so they can, in a way, try new ideas. They try a new business, and like let's make an example. If there is a food and beverage offer on one side of, let's say, a street, having a meanwhile use temporary on the opposite side with just chairs and tables and open spaces, that means that you support them, you support the food and beverage business, just with the creation of these spaces. And finally, we have, as Giovanni anticipated before, the financial value, which we need to ensure that, in a way, the business model works. If we raise capital, then we need to demonstrate to the investors that there is a generated value, and we need to ensure that the investment works. It is, in a way, let's say, a puzzle, a balance between social inclusion, economical investment, and the community. And finally, I think measurability is key. So as a developer, it is important to set up from the really beginning KPIs and to be able to measure them monthly, sometimes weekly. And this allows to better understand the benefits and what we could do differently and what works. And in addition, it helps to demonstrate to our investor that this product in specific is successful. Going to the question about costs, who needs to pay for this? It's a difficult question. It's really difficult to answer to this question, because I think there are different players on this game, and the cost should be, in a way, a contribution from all these actors. So the private has the role to reshape an area and to invest a major capital for the realization of a project, and to set up a project in phases and to give space for meanwhile use activations demonstrate an important contribution for the community. And the community, in a way, could benefit from this meanwhile use area, testing new ideas on a small format and having the opportunity to try. And the public contributes to the community as part, let's say, of its DNA. So, and in addition, the public contribution is important to tailor that project in that specific environment. So the key is the synergy between all these actors, because each of them must contribute to the meanwhile use activation. But in this way, the final result will benefit all of them. So
Great,
if you
Laura.
have any questions, yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think as you are placemaking, it is nice also to see in your job title this word. So you really work to create a place.
Yeah, correct.
And that is exactly what you were saying, talking about building a destination and also promoting synergies between all the different actors. I'd like to hear from Filippo if he's satisfied by the feedbacks we just received from our speakers, and if he wants to add something, some reflections or feedbacks again.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. Yes, I really appreciate the honesty and, you know, straightforward speaking about those that are real issues that don't have evident and easy solution. One point that Giovanni touched is, in my view, critical, and it was then rephrased in a very different way by Laura and Jonas, is what he called the pricing of positive externalities that Jonas addressed as additionality. And for Laura, clearly it was the investment of the private investors in those activities that benefit the community, not just the investor. Now, this is a tricky issue, and I'd like to hear more from all of you, because it's what I call private capital for public good, or private action for public good. And this is nice when it's, everybody likes it when it's philanthropy, because you get the reputation, the personal satisfaction. Fine, but this is not enough, because philanthropy is, it's very little compared to what are the financial markets and monetary exchanges. So the challenge that we face in order for the private agents, and I think that includes the individuals as well as the investors, is how, as a society, and so then as institutions, public institutions market, we put a value on that private contribution to public good, because that is the basis to build a public-private welfare strategy towards an inclusive and green transition. And at the moment, I haven't seen anything which is really strategic and mandatory in a certain way. I haven't seen it from the EIB, which has started talking about this, from the Juncker plan, but has never put a figure next to that societal impact. So the principle is there, but the investor does not know how to price it. And that has a trickle effects on states, on public authorities, but also financial markets. And financial markets are moving a lot on this. It's interesting that, for instance, Lend-Lease, but because I know them, put financial equivalent targets for their social value creation, and as well as we have seen in the climate change agenda, where we have very clear, on the other hand, targets. So I'd like all the speakers to come back on this issue about pricing in a way that is not just a personal exercise, but it becomes, we move towards a market and institutional standard. Thank you. Sorry, I took a bit too long, but.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll suggest to invert the line. So let's start with Laura this time.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
So, let's say it's a really difficult question. I think it's in a way maybe perhaps setting, let's say, a model that we can use, and also another point is that meanwhile use activation are becoming more popular and more popular. So I think the data that we can collect from these projects will support us to build, let's say, a benchmarking we can refer to. And it would be very interesting in a way to build, let's say, model that we can refer to during the development of this project. Because in a way, when you need to make this decision, you need to evaluate different values, different pros and cons. It's really, it depends on the project. It depends on the context where the project is located. So building, let's say, an algorithm or something that we can understand how all these elements will impact in that specific project, it could be helpful, but I think it's a long way. It's a very important question, and as Filippo said, we are not yet there. So yeah, it's understanding together with also the private and the banks how we can build this new approach.
Okay, great. Thanks. Jonas?
Hello. Yeah, I think it's quite a relevant and quite an interesting question. And I think from EIB point of view, we are maybe more kind of used to discussing how to price the negative externalities. It's something that is relevant in our selection of projects, in our cost-benefit analysis. For example,
io riesco. Cioè, no, io lo abbasso tutto, guarda.
Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. It was Massimo Bianchini. He has the
So externalities, for example, carbon is something that is being discussed, is to some extent being used, and that is, I think, what we are more used to when it really comes to pricing externalities. When it comes to maybe more prioritizing rather than pricing the kind of projects with positive externalities, with the kind of additionality, with the positive impact, we have a framework where we really need to argue that the products we do are additional, that they have this value added, and that we are addressing a market failure. And that is ensuring that we are not supporting the kind of standard products that any bank could do, but we are really supporting the kind of products where we as a public bank can add value, can be additional. And we are also, in particular on the loan officer side, I'm working on the product side, dealing more with due diligence and appraisal, but the loan officer, the large group in the EIB who look at the opportunities that clients, countries have when they go to products, they are very aware of the targets we have now set, this 50% climate action and environmental sustainability target. And of course, that influence their focus with regard to looking for the right kind of clients, looking for the right kind of products. We also have various policies for sectors like energy. We have a new energy lending policy that has taken a conscious decision out of fossil product support towards supporting more renewable energy and energy efficiency. So selection of products in light of this target that we have to meet by 2025 is another, if not pricing, at least prioritizing the products with these positive externalities that we would like to have. We have then, in addition, an option for products with real good impact to go beyond the 50% limit that EIB usually has to finance a product. We always need to co-finance with someone else, and the limit is usually 50%, but we can, in certain cases, go up to 75%. And that's a way of, in a way, pricing the positive impact of certain types of projects in certain contexts. There is also an opportunity for the loan officers and together with the credit risk officers to modulate the interest rate a bit. And that could be also used as a means of pricing or prioritizing the right kind of projects. But that said, the EIB is building the business model on that we are a AAA rated institution. We are able to raise capital at very advantageous terms, and we pass those advantages on to our clients with a small margin that cover our costs as a kind of non-profit institution. So we are from the beginning offering quite good terms, also long-term tenor and yeah. So in general, good things are looking good from the beginning, but we can have this opportunity to modulate if and where needed. But in addition to what we can do as a bank, I think what all of us can maybe look at and promote is to look at public procurement. I mean, in the EU, I think 14, 15, 16% of the EU GDP is publicly procured. And the public there has a really good opportunity to buy in their tender documents, introducing green, circular, maybe also some kind of social criteria, really promote the developers, the companies that are thinking a bit ahead, outside the box, and maybe, if that is the goal, promote this modularity, flexibility, open for the use of existing facilities, building, renovating instead of tearing down and rebuilding, etc. So I think public procurement could be a very interesting kind of means for promoting this valuing of positive externalities of certain kind of projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Giovanni.
Yes, I mean, it is a difficult question, no? How you price social externalities. I mean, I think fundamentally, I believe the answer is a policy thing, right? It cannot be the developer that resolves the issue. Let me start from something very positive. I guess the positive thing is that if you can get the private sector involved and investing in this, in the meanwhile uses, and more broadly, I guess, urban regeneration, you can unlock a huge amount of resource compared to trying to solve the problem without the private sector. So that's the positive thing, no? In terms of how you actually physically do it, right now I see two things that would help us. And remember, it was said at the beginning, we're in a very, very difficult environment now, no? So, you know, we are in a position where it's tough, no? The two things that I see are finance. So Jonas has just spoken, so maybe I will link into that. As a developer, now I'm going to, you know, we're speaking with banks. And, you know, we will need their support as well. We will see how they react to this period of difficulty that is coming. I wouldn't be surprised if some banks turned around to us and said, too much risk, right? So if I knew that, and I don't know exactly how it works with the European Investment Bank as an example, but there are other institutions that are kind of started to think in that way. You know, if a bank came to me and said, if you're going to meet these criteria, we maybe can offer a slightly lower rate, or at least we're going to be there when you need us. That would be a big shift in my way of thinking, because currently the cost that I get for borrowing is the same if I refurbish an office building in the middle of Milan where there's no social value whatsoever. I'm just kind of, you know, extracting value from a piece of real estate. compared to what we're doing in Florence, which I think generates huge positive externalities. And the fact that my financing costs the same, I think is wrong, right? I think it's wrong on the equity side as well. And there, I must say, CDP, we're in a joint venture partnership with CDP, which is the Italian government, is doing a good job. So it seems, because they see that the development creates a huge amount of positive externality, growth, well-being generally in the city, they have decided to remain involved while their plan was to get out, right? So having the government involved on the equity side will help a lot, because it will lower our equity returns, right? They're lower because the market is difficult, but that gives us support. So in my mind, institutions who are able to very explicitly state, if you meet these social criteria, social, environmental, governance, whatever it is, we will support you. For a private investor, is a very clear way of measuring, right? Because you say, okay, yeah, I can meet that. I can get a better support from a financial point of view. So that's the one very pragmatic way, and I'd be interested to have Jonas' perspective, because maybe he does it already. The second thing is a close collaboration with the local authorities. So something which is fundamental here in Florence, at least, is that we have a good relationship with the local authorities. Each of us understand their role. Again, to your original point, don't be hype. You don't need any hypocrisies in this, right? You need to understand what the reciprocal objectives are, and to find those places where you can really work together with them, right? If you can create a relationship of, obviously it's a tough discussion with them sometimes, but if it's done in a fair way, in a transparent way, and you trust each other not to trick each other into stupid things, then I think there's a huge amount of value to generate there, because you as a developer don't have to exploit it. They as an administration have to be,